So thank you all for joining the Monday afternoon webinar series. We're here for What Impact School Leadership Looks Like with Julie and Ray Smith. And now I'd like to turn over the meeting to Anna Messick, Executive Marketing Manager at Corwin, to introduce our presenters today. Anna, it's all yours.
Dr. Julie Smith is a 36-year veteran educator, speaker, consultant, and author. Dr. Raymond Smith is an accomplished author and former high school principal, director of high school education, and adjunct professor with more than 35 years of experience in leadership development. Their passion and areas of expertise is in building leadership capacity within people and systems, school improvement planning, and teacher, principal, and district evaluation models. All right, over to you guys.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Anna. Julie and I really want to thank you for joining us this afternoon or this evening, wherever you're at. Our passion for leadership development and instructional leadership specifically. Like it or not, No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds has forced school principals, school districts into a shift from management leadership to instructional leadership. But what is instructional leadership? That's the topic for today, but it's also the topic of our book, Evaluating Instructional Leadership, Recognized Practices for Success.
So as authors, we're currently asked during the writing process several questions, and one of those is, who is the intended audience for our book? And when Ray and I were planning and writing our book, certainly the first and foremost, it was all about principals, and I would also include assistant principals there who are interested and passionate about leveraging the high-yield instructional practices that have the greatest impact. A second intended audience was certainly the central office leaders that are there to support and to guide and all of our school leaders as well. But then certainly we're excited about all of our aspiring leaders, our teacher leaders who are focusing their goals on becoming principals and assistant principals and continuing to lead with their passion. Another question that we're continually asked is, how can our book be used, or how can the model that we've adopted, we've developed be used? And certainly one of those areas is that in our book, we have developed a principal evaluation model solely around the instructional domain, and certainly in working with districts to replace the existing principal evaluation model. Another way that our book has been used is to adapt or to modify existing principal evaluation systems within the components to dig deeper into that instructional leadership and what the research shows. But for the purpose of today, and most importantly as our book is being used internationally, is to really spread the expert use of that instructional leadership practices, to really go into what are best practices and what are their impacts on student achievement and teacher leading and learning. Another question that we're continually asked is, what is the point of the book? And certainly here we go to a quote that Professor Hattie wrote for us in our foreword of our book, because I think he really summarizes our passion and our belief. He talks really about that evaluation is for a purpose, and it's not an end in itself. It's really about identifying those exemplary practices and knowing what they look like. And then when we see them, that we want to replicate them within a school district and across the country, and really celebrating those successes that are all around us. So what we'd like to do now is we're going to try out our first poll everywhere, and Jeff's going to be putting up the results for us. So I'd like you, when you think about your current district principal evaluation model, what is the greatest challenge you have from the list below? I'm very aware that we have people here from the university and multiple varieties of positions. So if you might think about your experiences or districts that you're close to or individuals you work with. And I think, Jeff, we're going to take about 30 seconds to go ahead and we'll see our poll there.
I'm going to close the poll in about 15 seconds. If everyone could do that, that'd be great.
Interesting. So it looks like the largest largest category is F, employing growth plans only for poor performance. That's what we found. Okay. What we found as we did the research for our book was that most principal evaluation systems were plagued by 6 consuming challenges. We attempt to measure far too many domains of leadership practice that outstrips the available time to evaluate in a quality kind of manner. We also make the mistake that when we put all of the domains of leadership on a continuum, that we weight them all the same, and they are not. So we end up providing the least coverage in many cases for the practices that matter the most. And in some cases, we find that evaluation instruments are ambiguous standards, unclear performance expectations, and different than what the poll says. Many times we find evaluation systems that only employ growth plans as a way to mitigate less than proficient performance rather than requiring growth plans for everyone. So in what we found, first of all, that the research on instructional leadership was fairly thin, but there were 3 really encore efforts. The Council for Chief State School Officers and their work around the ISLIC standards is one to celebrate. Certainly the work of Karen Seashore Lewis and Kenneth Leithwood and their team around investigating the links to improved student achievement, and then Vivian Robinson and her colleagues around some of the best practices research that they did were efforts that we celebrated within our work. ISLIC standards, for instance, are broad policy standards that provide direction and guidance. The goal really is to articulate what effective leadership looks like, identify specific knowledge, skills, and dispositions that leaders should be displaying, and its use is broadly situated so that 45 states in the District of Columbia have used it in some way to shape their evaluation instruments or evaluation processes. Certainly, Karen Seashore Lewis's work, and that is focuses, key messages focused on instructional improvement, requires a school-wide focus on goals and expectations for student achievement. It underscores the fact that principals play a key role in supporting and encouraging teachers' professional development needs. And that principals must include careful attention to classroom instructional practices, citing that highly effective principals are in classrooms 30 to 60 times a week, with feedback going back to teachers. The best practices research coming from Vivian Robinson is an evidence, it's a synthesis of evidence that contributes to educational research and practice. It uncovers the particular leadership dimensions that are crucial for accomplishing increases in student achievement. And some of the key messages are that leaders play a vital role. You'll hear some common themes in among these 3 groups, and that educational leaders influence a range of student outcomes. The impact of school leaders varies based on types of leadership that we'll explore a little bit later here, and that the impact on student outcomes really depend on the particular practices that leaders use within their day-to-day engagement. The architecture for our instructional leadership ability rests on 5 pillars of dimensions and are supported by 10 theories of practice that we'll explore very briefly in just a few moments. And in fact, the 10 theories are as follows. First and foremost, that leaders see themselves as an evaluator of their impact constantly, that they have a clear understanding of the impact that they're having on teachers and thus on achievement. Second is that they are activators of change, that it's not that we're trying to meet teachers' needs, we're trying to really mess that up and help teachers exceed the very things that they thought they could achieve within the school setting. Third is a focus on learning more than teaching. And that notion is the idea that learning is very critical, and that it isn't that when we go into classrooms to observe classrooms that we're observing teachers, we should be observing the practices teachers are using, but the impact that those practices are having on student learning. A fourth one is I view assessment as feedback about my impact, and that is what kinds of assessments, real-time assessments, rapid formative assessments are principals using to get feedback about their practices to help them make adjustments in their leadership practices. Next is I engage in dialogue, not monologue. Most of the research about classroom performance is that teachers talk about 80% of the time, and we have schools that are infested by practices that are with leaders practicing or talking more to staff than listening to staff. So this idea of engaging in collaborative expertise is critical. Embracing the challenge of learning. Not all of us learn at the same time, the same rate. That's certainly true of adolescents, but it's also true of adults. The idea that I develop relational trust. We want teachers to develop classrooms where they have good relationships with kids, but it's beyond that. It's that they develop relationships such that kids know it's okay to make mistakes and thrive on errors, and we want principals developing that same kind of culture within their schools. The idea that I teach the academic vocabulary of learning is that there are certain learning dispositions we want teachers teaching kids to use in their learning within the classroom, and the same is true teaching or using learning dispositions that teachers are using to learn their craft and become experts in their teaching. The idea that learning is not straightforward, and that at times it moves us into the pit of not knowing, using some of James Nottinghouse and his work. And then last is that we will get much further collaborating with one another than closing the door and practicing our craft in isolation.
For our audience participants that are followers of Professor Hatties' research, you can see a nice correlation to his mind frames that really causes us to think about how we see our role and frame the decisions that we make consistently every day. So let's take a few moments and let's just go a little bit deeper into a couple of them. And the one that I want to touch upon first is evaluating your impact. And this is all about inspired and passionate leaders who really believe that their most essential job is to continuously seek feedback about their influence or their impact on students and teachers, that they are talking about the successes, they're knowing the problems in their leadership practices, and they're continually celebrating with their staff. You'll notice that in our book, as well as on each of these slides, we have a list of critical questions that really cause our practitioners who are reading our book become that metacognitive or that self-reflective practitioner. And so some of those questions with this specific one are for leaders to really think about what evidence might I gather that would convince me that this influence or this strategy or this program that we're using in our school is really working, that's having an impact on student achievement, and how do my leadership practices really compare with what the research is suggesting. So what we'd like you to do now is we're going to try another poll here. And so we'd like you to look at and think about how intentionally are you continually evaluating in a summative manner your impact that you're having on your teachers and ultimately on your students. So let's just take maybe about 20 seconds, Jeff, and let's see what we get here. You'll notice that we also call the theory of practice our top, the top 10. Okay, let's look at our results. So occasionally, so when we really look at the research, this is one I think that all of us as leaders really need to be mindful of and really thinking about how are we continually knowing and evaluating the impact that we're having on those that we're serving. Let's take another look at another one. This one has to do with focusing on learning more than teaching. And once again, these are those leaders that really thrive on discussions and dialogue with their colleagues and teachers and other principals and central office about their learning and about the learning of their teachers and the learning of each other versus spending the time looking at teacher practices. I love the analogy that really says, like Michelangelo is a master painter, that we need to become the Michelangelos of our own learning and really creating as well as that broad stroke, but also that thin line of impact on both the students as well as adult learning. And certainly the last bullet, we really, we're always encouraging teachers to identify strategies or their dispositions, if you will, for learning. And as adults, we really need to do the same. And here you can see, once again, some of the critical questions that we would ask our audience and our readers to really think about as they are focusing on learning more than teaching. So once again, we're going to do another poll to see if our audience, how often do you intentionally find yourself focusing your conversations, your dialogue, more on learning than on the teaching? So again, it looks like we have maybe just about 10 seconds left. Again, how often do we engage our dialogue, our focus with other colleagues? And we're looking here, once again, occasionally at the 31%, really looking at how often do we engage, and continuously was at the 12% there. So let's go ahead and let's look at another theory of practice a little bit more deeply. So the next one here is viewing assessment as feedback to me. And just as we talked about evaluating your impact is about the summative data that we're collecting as a result of our impact, this one really focuses on the formative feedback. How are we continually and often and frequently collecting feedback, from our teachers, from our students, when we bring in teacher voice, student voice, parent voice about the impact that we're having, and most importantly, how are we modifying, adjusting, and scaling to practice based on the feedback that we're hearing. And I love this last one that really talks about public displays of impact. How often as leaders are we really regularly displaying the feedback that we're sharing about our own performance and about our impact as a school? And once again, here you can see some critical questions. The first one, when we're having professional development, who are the teachers that as a result of professional development did we teach well, and who did we not teach well? How do we develop a collective understanding of progress among teachers in the schools. So around this theory of practice or top, it really causes to be that mindful and that reflective practitioner. So once again, let's take another quick poll to see where we fall on this one as well. Again, this is viewing assessment as feedback to me. How are we using formative feedback? Just as we ask our teachers to regularly use formative feedback to adjust their teaching, how are we using formative feedback to adjust our leadership? Okay, Jeff, let's go ahead and see. Kind of looking at our time, let's see where our results are. So once again, we're playing really pretty with that number C, right, occasionally. So I think it causes us all to be really mindful of the practices, knowing that these are high-yield instructional practices that will result in a greater impact on student achievement. So when we really look at knowing Professor Hatties' work, that he talks about that 95% of everything that teachers do in our schools has some impact. It's the same for leaders. We know that the practices that we are taught, that we do in our buildings each and every day, that will have some impact. But what we want to do, looking at the amount of time and energy and resources that we have, how do we really leverage? What are those high-yield instructional leadership practices that make the most difference? And for this, we look to one of the quality tools, and many of you will recognize this as called the Pareto Principle. I mean, I know I had an opportunity to be a principal for 17 years, and it was always very true, no matter what building I was in, the 80-20, that 80% of all my discipline came from about 20% of my students. It's a very exact same thing when we look to leadership practices. About 80% of our leadership impact will come from 20% of your leadership practice. So it's essential for all of us as leaders in our building and central office and at the university level who are working with our leaders to really begin to identify where are we going to put our time and our energy to have the greatest impact. So briefly, to look at Professor Hatties' barometer of influence, we begin to look at that will help us explain as we move into looking at instructional leadership, that we look at, when we look at his influences on achievement, we know that there are some things that actually cause learning to go backwards. Certainly we know that those to be mobility and retention. We know that there are things that have up to a 0.20 impact. Those are the developmental, that, you know, just by students becoming a year older, you know, that there's learning that occurs. And we begin to look at the typical teacher effects between half a year all the way up to the 0.40, which is the hinge point for the year. What is their impact? And when we talk about impact, we talk about for those students that are in our classrooms in front of our teachers consistently for that year, what is the impact of a student achievement that we're having? And where we really want to focus our time and our energy is having the dialogue about what are those things that the teachers and leaders are doing in the zone of desired effects. What are those things that have an average of all influences of a 0.40 or above, which really equates to approximately a year's growth. So thinking about that 0.40, let's take that to the leadership level and look at the research or the meta-analysis that Professor Hattie did on research. So if you begin to look at this, Professor Hattie looked at the research. Ray really talked nicely about the body of evidence, and specifically we're going to be referencing the work here of Vivian Robinson. And so what excites me is that you can see as leaders we have more than an indirect impact, we have a direct impact of a 0.39, almost approximately a year's growth. But this is one of those influences that also has the moderating effects. And what that means is that Vivian Robinson went out and she didn't say to herself, does leadership have an impact? Because she knew the answer to that. And the answer is absolutely yes, we do as principal leaders. But she asked what type of leadership has the greatest impact. And Vivian and her colleagues, what they found most written about, while there are others, is the difference between transformational and instructional leadership. So I'm going to show you the list right here and give you a minute to look at them and ask you to poll which one you feel has the greatest impact on student achievement. Remember, that's what Professor Hattie looked at. That's what we're looking at. So take a moment and read the Transformational Leadership list. And now let's look at the Instructional Leadership. And having shared this many, many times with large and small groups, I know that many of you are thinking that they both are very important, and you need to know the research really shows that. Both transformational and instructional leadership are important, and we need to look at them as leaders of our buildings and of our districts. But once again, we're looking at which one has the greatest impact on student achievement, transformational or instructional. Let's take a few minutes and I guess a few seconds. Right, Jeff, I think we can probably go ahead and put this one up and let's see where our audience is polling. What's our result? So certainly we have the instructional 29, but we're really kind of split there. Before I go to the next slide, the one thing that I want to be really mindful of again is to share that both of them are important and important for us as school leaders and district leaders to know what that looks like to have an impact on our school. But again, we're looking at the impact on student achievement. So let's go ahead and look at those results. Go to the next one. So when we begin to look at that, I think we're going to see the surprise that when we look at transformational versus instructional leadership, it's almost 4 times the impact when we look at instructional leadership as 0.42. The point that I really want to make that Vivian Robinson makes so clearly is that transformational leadership has the greatest impact on the teachers within the system, within our buildings, but has yet to find its way alone in isolation to have an impact on student achievement. But when we look at the practices of our principals around instructional leadership, they do have well, over a year's impact on student achievement. So let's look at Vivian Robinson's research, and I'll give you a moment to look at this. What she did is she identified in her research 5 leadership elements, and you can see how she really defines those. So keeping those in mind, what I'd like you to do for a moment is let's go ahead and check in. So based on her 5 leadership elements, which of these do you think has the greatest impact on student achievement? Again, we're kind of drilling down based on what she and her colleagues found in the research. Establishing a shared vision mission, strategic resourcing, how are we spending our time, our energy, and our dollars? Looking at ensuring teacher and staff effectiveness through walkthroughs, observations, or evaluation. Leading and participating in teacher learning, being part of the job-embedded professional development and the learning that's going on. And then looking at it, providing an orderly and safe environment. So Jeff, let's go ahead and take a look. Yeah, so we begin to look at that at the 31%, leading and participating in teacher learning, but also a strong 25% as ensuring effectiveness in teacher. Both important. So let's look to what Vivian Robinson found in her research.
So what she found is coming up 5th is providing an orderly, safe, and supportive environment at 0.27, about a quarter of a year's improvement, or a half a year's improvement, excuse me, in student achievement, followed by strategic resourcing, a tie for second at just over a year at establishing a shared vision, mission, goals, and expectations, ensuring teacher and staff effectiveness, and the number one position, as you suggested in your poll, is that leading and participating in teacher learning and development is critical. And the operative word here is that the leaders are leading and participating in, not just setting it up, inviting somebody in, introducing them, and then stepping back, but actually participating with teachers alongside of them in the professional development that they're engaged in. Other high impact practices that leaders can engage in are the following. I'll give you a moment to look at that. But I want to focus, as we think about these, I want to focus on the second from last, the extent to which principals, I'm sorry, the third from last, whether principals are monitoring the effectiveness of school practices and their impact on student learning. The operative word there is, or phrases are, whether they're monitoring the effectiveness of school practices that teachers are using. So one of the things that we found very critical is that we expect teachers with students to be very clear about learning intentions and success criteria. In other words, what is it that is the goal for the learning, and what does success look like along the way? We also have to do the same thing with teachers. So when we develop school improvement plans and we develop targets or learning goals, we also are obliged to identify success criteria, rubric, if you will, a set of guidelines that help teachers understand what it means to implement effective feedback at the proficient or higher level. One of the things that we do in our book is that we identify, to help readers identify the fact that each of these elements are defined. We define 4 different categories of performance, variations in performance, that range from exemplary down to not meeting expectations. And then we also provide a rubric description of what that particular element looks like, that ranges also from exemplary down to not meeting expectations. If we take the 4th element, which is leading and participating in teacher, leader, learning, and development, we identify the critical attributes of the leader, again, ranging from the left-hand performance, which is exemplary, down through not meeting. And we also provide then some real-world examples under each of these performance variations. We understand from the research that effective feedback doubles the speed of learning. And there are lots of sources of feedback for principals. One source is certainly the principal's evaluator to the leader. Another is the leader to the evaluator, which, according to John's research, is probably perhaps the most important feedback, is so that the evaluator understands the leader's point of view and uses that information. Another one is leader to leader, and another is leader to self. The purpose of feedback is to reduce discrepancies between current understandings, performance, and the learning goal or target. In other words, the purpose of feedback is to get people from where they are now to where they want or need to be, which means we need to help them bridge the learning gap and move people across this gap effectively. Imagine, if you will, that you're giving a principal or principals feedback around professional development. We understand from John Hattie and Helen Temperley's work on feedback that there are 4 levels of feedback. One is task level feedback, which is really offered to individuals who are new to the material. They're considered novices in their performance. The next is process feedback, which is offered to individuals who have some degree of proficiency. And then next is self-regulation feedback, and that's offered to individuals who have a high degree of proficiency. So if we were looking at a principal who had a low degree or new material, novice principal around professional development, feedback to them might look like something like this. Largely, task feedback is really about what's right and what's wrong and providing the leader more superficial information about the content. If we were dealing, however, with a principal with some degree of proficiency, then we really want to help them to detect errors in their work and rely on some self-regulation skills. And the feedback at that level might sound something like this. At the self-regulation level, if we were dealing with a principal with a high degree of proficiency, we would probably offer feedback that would help them to take their skills and apply it, and their effectiveness, apply it to others. So the feedback might sound something like this. In each of these examples of feedback, the goal is to address three basic questions. Where am I going? What's the goal? Where am I at currently against that goal? And then what are my next steps? The fourth level of feedback is at the top is called praise. And praise might sound something like this. And what you notice from the praise feedback is that it is almost void entirely of any of the task, process, or self-regulation. And that is, what's the goal, where am I at, and where to next? Which means that praise really causes learners of all ages to go backwards and is negatively associated with increases in student achievement or adult performance. So let's check in a little bit. Considering your principal evaluation system, how often do principals receive feedback at their instructional level, their performance level? Go ahead and close that out, Jeff, if you would. So basically, most of us are thinking that seldom do principals receive that feedback, and yet the critical piece is that if we expect teachers to be giving students feedback that addresses those issues, where am I at, task level feedback, performance and self-regulation, and then answering the three questions, then we ought to expect that the same kind of feedback is used when principals are doing classroom observations with teachers.
So as we continue to think about the high-yield leadership practices that have the greatest impact, we know that what we learn about leadership is that it is not about an innate talent. It is something that we can consistently learn, and that we do need to become practice. We need to practice what we're doing, and we need to begin to look at that. Learning is hard work, and it is the concentration of the head, it's the perseverance of the heart, and it's the deliberate practice of the hand. But it's just not any practice that we're consistently doing when we begin to look at that. We begin to look at that this practice is occurring in a very highly supportive environment with a lot of trust that it's okay for us as leaders to be making mistakes, that we are setting goals that are not just SMART goals, but they're highly ambitious goals, and they're smarter goals. We're continually reevaluating those. That we're supervised by a series, a variety of coaches that are helping us grow and develop as those leaders. And really it's all about refining our techniques through the repetition, but most importantly, as Ray just really talked about that specific feedback. So let's look for a moment to a leadership framework. If we look at this leadership framework and think about it, that's a way to really represent the relationship between two different variables. And let me help you understand what we're looking at right here. If you look at the vertical axis right here, this is achievement results, and this is achievement results from low to high. Let's look at the horizontal, and these are the antecedents of excellence, and what that means is from low to high. What are the adults in the system? What are they doing or not doing that are having an impact on student achievement low to high? So vertical is student achievement, and we're looking then below, we're comparing that to what are the adults doing. So let's look at the first quadrant. This is the quadrant where as leaders that we, and as a school or as a district, we're really losing ground. We're not getting the results that we want. And as a result of not getting the results, because this is not about not working hard, it's working really hard, putting in a lot of practices, a lot of programs. But when the results do not come out like we think that they should, that we have no understanding because we have not really monitored those results. And so continually the next year, the next month, whenever we really replicate the same procedures, and mistakes are likely again. Let's go ahead and look at, these are when we are lucky, or in our lucky schools, that these are when schools are getting the high results or the district, but once again, they still have gaps within their learning. Again, that there is low understanding when teachers and leaders are asked, what is it specifically that you're doing that's resulting in the impact? And we're really beginning to talk about the difference between achievement and progress. And in this area right here, just like in losing, we are not seeing the achievement, or excuse me, the progress gains that we want to see. So let's look over here, let's look at the learning. This is an area where we're still not happy with our results, but we're seeing the movement, we're seeing the progress. But as leaders and teachers, we're having that dialogue about learning. What is making the most difference for our teachers and most importantly for our students within the system, so that it's highly unlikely then that we're replicating the same mistakes over and over. And when we look at the last quadrant, this is all about leading. This is when we are moving, we're having high progress for all of our students within our learning communities, and we are beginning to see the progress take place in the high results and the high understanding of those 2 to 3, 4 instructional practices, leadership practices that are making the most difference systematically for our students and for our adult learners as well. So if we begin to look at the focus of our book, the focus of instructional leadership is all about being the lead learners and really moving from leading, where we're not getting the results we want, to learning. And that really talks about deliberate practice, really the impact of leadership. It's about a commitment to the deliberate practice, which is one of our theories of practice, that it's difficult and it is hard work. When we look at deliberate practice, we look at that it has 3 components, and these components go right back to 3 of the tops of theory of practice that we talked about, that we're continually evaluating the impact that we're having on those that we're working with, that we're viewing assessment as feedback to us consistently, monitoring that formative feedback, and that we are persevering and that learning is hard work.
So when you're developing your own growth plan, which of the following 3 features are not included? Select all that apply. Let's take a few seconds to get your input on this.
Again, the optional word here is not, that they do not apply. When we're talking about your growth plan, we're really talking about your goal-setting plans that you set many times within the district, within your school, with your teachers, that hopefully are tied to your school improvement planning as well. Okay, Jeff, let's go ahead and take a look. see our results.
So typically, B is not included, measures both the degree to which the leadership practice is implemented and its impact on student achievement. And we would concur with that. One of the things that we found in our work is that part of developing a growth plan is that there are some key features to a what we call a deliberate plan of action. One feature is that clearly the leader's focus of attention is on something that is of critical importance to the organizational development. Second is that it's drawn from and connects to the school's continuous improvement, school improvement plan. And third is that it focuses on 1 to 2 high-impact leadership practices that leverage goal attainment. And that when you develop your leadership strategies, it's an actionable, measurable leadership strategy against the impact or its impact on student achievement. Those 5 or 4 features are absolutely essential to a growth plan. Also essential to the growth plan is that it vertically aligns. It links the actions of leaders throughout from their growth plans, their deliberate practice plans, to school improvement plans, to teacher and principal evaluation processes. In our work with school districts across the country, this example comes from Shelby County in Kentucky. They developed what they called a POP, their plan on a page. And you'll notice that the school-wide problem of practice really is about they identified some map data that they were underperforming in, and they concluded that perhaps they weren't doing a good enough job with teachers in the classrooms around learning intentions and later on success criteria using that. Their SMART goal was around increasing student participation on the MAP data. Their leadership practice was providing monthly feedback to teachers around their learning intentions, and they were relating that, to increases in student achievement. In other words, the principal in this case, J.J. Black, was attempting to figure out a goal. Where is she going? How is she going there? And where to next? And so in her effort, she developed what we deem as public displays of affection. As an old high school principal, I often dealt with the issue of public displays of affection. In this case, it's public displays of my impact. And what this represents is a one-sheet display of the principal's impact in relationship to student performance. So on the vertical axis is percent proficient, going from 0 to 100. Next is you are measuring your leadership strategy, number 1, which could be the leadership strategy is implementing effective feedback. In other words, having all teachers implement feedback according to the way the research describes effective feedback at the proficient or higher level, and what's the relationship of that implementation to increases in student achievement. It might be a writing assessment that you perform on a monthly basis, and so you measure this monthly. You measure the leadership strategy, in other words, the degree to which teachers are implementing effective feedback at the proficient or higher level against how kids are performing. And you can see how in this example, how the relationship exists and the conversations that might spill out between evaluator and principal. In other words, it's focusing on high-impact practices, whether principals are monitoring the effectiveness of school practices and their impact on student learning, well over the 0.40 hinge point. One way of doing this is you develop some success criteria. This is around feedback that the principal might be giving to teachers. And so you develop a criteria, and the left-hand, the right-hand column is a self-assessment column, which is U is usually, S is sometimes, R is regularly, and you ask for feedback. You can circulate this on a monthly basis, collect all samples, and use that feedback to adjust performances. So there are three big ideas that result from this, our time together. First of all, that leadership practices have a differential impact. Not all leadership practices are created equal. Some have a disproportionate impact, and when we're looking at time management, we need to be making sure that principals are devoting time to those practices that have the greatest impact on student achievement. Second is a focus on a few high-impact leadership practices. That is that we ought not expect leaders to do more than they have time to do, or our time to monitor and provide effective feedback and next learning opportunities. And third is that we need to measure the depth of implementation and impact. Those are three critical features, big ideas coming from our time with you today. So which of these big ideas reflect new learning for you, and which would you plan to use to improve your own practice? Take a few seconds. And closing this out, Jeff. This is good feedback for us. So C is measuring both depth of implementation as well as impact was of greatest importance to you, and we have found the same to be true with people that we have interacted with across the nation.
So I think that really fits nicely with the last poll as well, that really talked about that. One of the things that is probably non-existent in our current system is that really monitoring and evaluating both what we call the cause and effect data, the data that's coming directly from the students, which is the effect data, but also really looking at that cause data. What is the relationship between what the adults in our system are doing to have an impact on student achievement? So as we bring this time to a close, I know that we're a few minutes over, and we appreciate you staying with us. Raymond, I would like to thank you for letting us become part of your school after hours or your home, no matter wherever you are, and sharing a little bit about our passion and a very, very brief summary of some of the highlights in the work that we've been doing all around instructional leadership. And I think, Jeff, if there's any questions, I'm not certain where we are with time, but we'd be happy to answer any of those questions.
I think at this time, there really are no questions to pass along. If anything comes up, we'll answer those in email to people. But for now, I'll turn it back over to Anna.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Julie and Ray. That was wonderful. So I just wanted to talk about Julie and Ray's, their work. They are the authors of Evaluating Instructional Leadership, Recognized Practices for Success, and they also provide workshops in North America and Canada around Dr. John Hatties' research on visible learning and Dr. Russ Qualia's work on student voice. The Smiths also offer Evaluating Instructional Leadership seminars where they outline the 8 recognized practices for success in leadership coaching and evaluation, and they also offer long-term consulting and support in districts across the nation. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Please join us for our upcoming webinars featuring leading experts such as Peter DeWitt, Michael Fullen, Charlotte Danielson, and many more. You can find the full calendar on our Corwin website. And thank you again for attending Corwin's Monday afternoon webinar series on a Tuesday.
Thank you to everybody. Have a great evening. Our emails are up there. If you'd like to email us directly, we'd be happy to engage with dialogue or to share any of our resources with you.